corrupt racist police stop White House advisor's car, and the tragic ending. On an ordinary afternoon in Washington, D.C., the streets were bustling as usual with commuters, tourists, and the hum of city life. The weather was clear, and the sun shone brightly through the windows of passing cars. Among the traffic, a sleek black sedan cruised through the streets, its windows tinted just enough to keep the inside out of view. Inside the car were two key White House advisors, men who had dedicated their lives to shaping policies that affected the country's future. Their mission was crucial. They had just wrapped up a high-level meeting at the White House and were heading to a secure location for the next phase of their work. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging ideas and thoughts on the most recent developments. They didn't expect any disruptions. After all, they were in the capital city, surrounded by power and security, and their status meant they were rarely stopped on the road. But that afternoon, something was about to change. As the sedan drove down a quiet street, the calm of the day was suddenly interrupted. The bright red and blue lights of a police car flashed in the rearview mirror. The advisors exchanged a quick glance, both slightly surprised, but not immediately alarmed. A traffic stop was not out of the ordinary, and given the importance of their work, they didn't anticipate much of an issue. They were used to being recognized or even flagged down by law enforcement officers, and they assumed this was no different. They signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, the police car following closely behind. The car's sirens were off, but the flashing lights continued to blink, casting an eerie glow on the otherwise calm street. The advisors remained composed as the car came to a stop. One of them rolled down the window slightly, waiting for the officer to approach. The officer, a man in his late 30s, walked towards the sedan with a confident stride. His uniform was neat, his belt loaded with gear, and his sunglasses perched on his head, offering a sense of authority. As he reached the car, the advisors greeted him politely, expecting the usual exchange of license and registration. However, the officer didn't immediately ask for the standard information. Instead, his eyes quickly scanned the inside of the car, lingering on the advisors before speaking. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not yet hostile. The advisors looked at each other, both confused but not concerned. They were sure they hadn't done anything wrong, so the question caught them off guard. "No, officer," one of them replied, his tone calm. "Is there an issue?" The officer paused for a moment, his gaze narrowing slightly. "I don't know," he said, his tone now colder. "You were driving a little too fast for my liking. You might be in a hurry, but that doesn't mean you can break the law." Both advisors were surprised. The car had been moving at the speed limit, and they hadn't even noticed anything out of the ordinary. But they didn't want to escalate the situation, so they nodded and explained that they were simply on their way to another important meeting. The officer, however, didn't seem interested in their explanation. He took a few more steps back, looking over the car again before approaching the window once more. This time he was more direct, his voice tinged with something that the advisors couldn't place. Was it suspicion? "Hostility, you look like someone who's important. Are you?" the officer asked, staring at them intently. The question felt out of place, and one of the advisors shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The advisor, sensing the tension in the air, answered politely, "We work for the White House, sir. We have a lot of work ahead of us." He tried to keep his voice steady, but the officer's demeanor was starting to unsettle him. The officer raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "A White House advisor, huh?" he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words in the air. His eyes drifted to the other advisor and then back to the first one. "I don't know if I believe that." "You people think you can just do whatever you want, huh?" The advisors exchanged a quick glance, both unsure of how to respond. There was something off about this officer, something that didn't sit right with them. It wasn't just the tone of his voice, it was his whole attitude. His words were dripping with suspicion, and the tension between them was growing palpable. "Officer," the other advisor spoke up, trying to defuse the situation. "We're just trying to get to our next meeting. We really don't want to hold you up." The officer ignored him, now demanding identification with a sharp gesture. His tone was no longer friendly, it was almost demanding. The advisors complied, each reaching for their wallets slowly, making sure not to make any sudden movements. As they handed over their IDs, the officer took them without another word. He walked back to his patrol car, keeping his eyes on the sedan the whole time. The advisors sat quietly in the car, both trying to make sense of the situation. What was happening? Why was this officer being so hostile? They had been pulled over before, but never like this. Minutes passed in silence. The officer was in his car, speaking into his radio, his back to the advisors. The tension in the air was thick. Each second felt heavier than the last. Neither of the advisors knew what to say. They just wanted to get out of this situation, but they could sense that things were escalating beyond their control. Finally, the officer returned, his expression colder than before. He handed back their IDs without speaking. But instead of just letting them go, he stayed standing by the car, his hand resting on the side of the vehicle as though waiting for something more to happen. "We'll be taking a look inside the car," he said abruptly, his voice colder than before. There was no warning, no explanation, just an order. The advisors felt a sudden surge of alarm. This wasn't routine. This wasn't normal. They exchanged worried looks, but neither knew how to respond. They had followed the officer's instructions so far, but now the situation felt out of control. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was something far darker. The advisors exchanged a glance as the officer's words sank in. They knew this wasn't a regular stop anymore, and it was clear that the officer had something else in mind. They had followed every rule: no speeding, no erratic driving, and no illegal behavior. Yet here they were, caught in a situation that felt like it was spiraling out of control. One of the advisors, still calm but now on edge, took a deep breath. "Officer, what exactly do you mean by looking inside our vehicle? We've complied with everything you've asked so far. We're just trying to get to our next meeting." His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. He hoped his words might help calm the officer down, but instead, the officer didn't respond with reason. Instead, he seemed to grow more agitated, his posture stiffening. "I'm not asking for your permission," the officer replied sharply. "I'm telling you, open the car, now." His tone left no room for negotiation. The advisors felt the air thicken with tension. They didn't know what to expect next, but something about the officer's attitude was unsettling. He wasn't acting like a law officer concerned with routine procedure. This felt personal, like he had made up his mind about them from the moment he saw them. As the advisor hesitated, the officer took a step forward, his hand resting on the side of the vehicle in a way that made the car feel smaller, more confined. There was a moment of hesitation before the advisor, who had been driving, slowly reached for the handle to open the door. He wasn't sure what the officer might do, but he knew that any sign of resistance might make things worse. The officer didn't wait for them to fully comply. He moved to the back of the car, and with a forceful shove, he opened the trunk himself. The advisors watched in silence, both anxious about what was happening. It wasn't just the intrusion into their privacy, it was the way the officer was treating them, as if they were already guilty of something. "Just a routine check," the officer muttered to himself as he rummaged through the trunk. The advisors could hear the scraping of metal against metal as the officer tossed aside their belongings with little care. Papers, folders, and a couple of briefcases were thrown around haphazardly, as if the officer were looking for something specific. But neither advisor could understand what he might be searching for. There was nothing in the car that could have raised suspicion, just personal items and professional papers. "I didn't give you permission to do this," one of the advisors finally spoke, his voice more forceful this time. The officer didn't turn around, but his body language tightened. He knew he was pushing the boundaries, and he didn't care. The officer paused for a moment, standing up and slowly closing the trunk. He turned back toward the car with an expression that seemed to mix arrogance with disdain. "You think you're special because you work for the White House, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You think that gives you the right to do whatever you want?" The advisor inside the car felt his stomach tighten. They had never been treated like this before, not by any officer, not by anyone. It didn't matter who they were or what they did. They were just trying to do their jobs, and this officer was treating them like criminals. The officer's words echoed in the advisor's mind, lingering in the air between them. There was something about the officer's tone, something darker than just a power trip. It was as if he had already decided who these men were without giving them a chance. The advisor could feel the weight of the officer's assumptions pressing down on them. "Listen, officer," the other advisor said, trying again to reason with him. This has gone far enough. You've checked our car, you've seen our IDs, and we've told you who we are. There's no need to make this harder than it is. But the officer didn't want to hear it. His gaze never wavered from the two men in the car. His eyes were cold, his stance firm. There was no sign of understanding or empathy, just suspicion and contempt. "Not my problem," the officer sneered, his voice growing louder. "I don't trust people like you. You think you're above the law, above everyone else. I've seen people like you before. Think you can come in here and change everything, right? You won't get away with it." The advisor inside the car, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke up. "This isn't about us thinking we're above anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about doing what's right, following the rules, and getting on with our work. We're not your enemy." But the officer wasn't listening anymore. His eyes narrowed and his hand twitched toward his belt where his weapon was holstered. The advisors could feel the tension rise to a boiling point. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was something deeper, something more personal. The officer's hand stayed on his weapon as he leaned closer to the car. "You don't get to tell me what's right," he spat, his breath heavy with anger. "I make the rules here, not you." The atmosphere inside the car grew heavy. The advisors exchanged a quick glance, both of them sensing the danger that was unfolding. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't signed up for this. They were just trying to do their job, to go about their day without any trouble. But this officer seemed to be looking for trouble, and he wasn't going to stop until he found it. The advisor who had been trying to reason with the officer spoke again, his voice soft but desperate. "We don't want any trouble. Please, just let us go." The officer ignored him, and instead he took a step back from the car, his eyes still locked on them. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, neither side knew what to do. The advisor sat frozen in the car, unable to move, waiting for the next unpredictable move from the officer. Suddenly, the officer stepped away from the car, but only to walk over to his squad car. He was talking into his radio now, and the advisors could hear snippets of conversation, but they couldn't make out the words. Their minds raced as they tried to figure out what to do next. Should they stay in the car and wait it out, or should they try to drive away? The officer returned a moment later, still keeping his distance. "I've called for backup," he announced, his voice now dripping with certainty. "You're not going anywhere." The advisors were trapped. They could feel the reality of the situation settling in. The officer wasn't going to let them go easily. They had no choice but to wait, unsure of what was coming next. And in that moment, they realized that no matter how important they were, no matter how many rules they followed, they were at the mercy of a corrupt system. They were just two people in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a web of power, suspicion, and prejudice. The tragic turn of events was already set in motion. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The advisor in the front seat shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. They were stuck in a situation that seemed to grow more unpredictable with every passing moment. The officer had called for backup, and now the air felt even heavier. The weight of the officer's words still lingered in the vehicle. "You're not going anywhere." As the advisor sat there, he couldn't shake the thought that something was terribly wrong. What started as a simple traffic stop had now spiraled into something much darker. The officer's hostility was palpable, and his actions were becoming increasingly erratic. The advisor who had been sitting quietly now felt the grip of fear tighten around his chest. The idea that they were at the mercy of someone who had already decided they were guilty was terrifying. He glanced at the other advisor, who seemed to be taking a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It was clear they were both in a similar state of disbelief. This wasn't just about a simple traffic violation or a misunderstanding. It was about something much more dangerous. And there was no telling what would happen next. The officer was now pacing near his squad car, speaking into his radio in low tones. The advisor couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in the officer's voice made it clear that something was unfolding. What could be so important? Were they really in trouble, or was this just a power play? Time seemed to crawl as the advisors waited in tense silence. They tried to think of what to do, but the officer had effectively boxed them in. There were no easy options. Leaving would only make things worse. They had no idea when or if backup would arrive, but they knew they had to stay calm. The worst thing they could do now was give in to panic. Suddenly, the officer turned and began walking toward the car again, his face stern. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. The advisor in the front seat felt his heart rate spike. What was coming next? The officer was clearly playing a game, and the advisors were caught in the middle of it. There was no telling how far he would take this. The officer stopped just short of the car, standing outside the driver's window. He didn't immediately speak, but his eyes flicked from one advisor to the other, lingering for a long moment on each of them. The silence was unnerving. The officer's voice finally broke through the quiet, cold, and calculated. "You're not just some government workers," he said, his words almost dripping with disdain. "You're the ones trying to change things, trying to make rules like you're above everyone else. Do you think you can just waltz in and fix everything, huh? Do you think I don't see through that?" The advisor in the passenger seat tried to remain calm. "We're just doing our jobs, sir. We're here to help to make things better. There's no need for this hostility." He kept his voice steady, but there was a tightness in it that betrayed his nervousness. He could feel the heat from the officer's glare, and it was hard to know if he was even listening. The officer's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "Helping? You're just part of the system, part of a machine that doesn't care about anyone but itself. You think people trust you? You think people trust any of you?" His voice had grown louder, more hostile, his anger unmistakable. The advisor swallowed hard, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. This wasn't just about following the rules, it was about survival. The officer wasn't just angry, he was personal. He wasn't looking for answers or explanations. He wanted to prove a point, and the advisors were caught in his crossfire. "We're not trying to be above anyone," the advisor in the front seat said, his tone firm but quiet. "We just want to get through this, and we're asking for you to let us go." The officer's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "No, you're not getting it," he snapped, his voice growing even more forceful. "You think you're just going to drive away without consequences. That's not how this works. I'm the one in charge here." At that moment, the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, the unmistakable wail of backup approaching. The advisor knew the game had changed again. The arrival of more officers meant that things were about to escalate. There was no going back now. As the sirens drew closer, the officer took a step back from the car, turning his head slightly toward the incoming vehicles. The advisors could see his muscles tense as he shifted his weight. It was clear that he was preparing for something. They could feel the pressure mounting in the air. This was no longer just a traffic stop, but something much more volatile. The new officers arrived within moments, pulling up behind the squad car. The advisors didn't know what to expect, but they feared it wouldn't be good. The officer who had been speaking to them gestured toward the car, his voice low as he gave instructions. The new officers nodded and stood at attention, but there was no sign of friendliness or professionalism. The advisors felt an icy chill run down their spines. This wasn't just about a stop anymore, it was about making an example of them. The advisor who had been sitting quietly now leaned over to his colleague, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here. This isn't just about us anymore." The other advisor nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward the officers. He wasn't sure what was going to happen, but the feeling of impending danger was impossible to ignore. They had no way of knowing what the officers would do next, and the anxiety in their stomachs was overwhelming. The officer who had initially stopped them turned back to face them once more, his demeanor suddenly shifting. "You two need to come with us," he ordered, his voice filled with finality. The advisors didn't understand. What did they mean, "come with us"? Where were they being taken? One of the new officers opened the rear door of the squad car, motioning for the advisors to exit the vehicle. "Out of the car," he commanded, his tone harsh but not unreasonably so. The advisors looked at each other. They were being detained, though they didn't fully understand why. Were they being arrested? Or was this just a form of intimidation? Either way, they knew they couldn't stay in the car any longer. With a deep breath, the advisor in the front seat opened his door, stepping out cautiously. The other advisor followed, both of them now on alert. As they stood beside the car, they were flanked by officers, their eyes watching their every move. The advisors tried to keep their composure, but every nerve in their bodies was screaming that they were in danger. "Walk with us," one of the new officers instructed, his tone cold. They had no choice but to follow, but as they walked toward the squad car, something shifted. A sense of unease crept over them, and they couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a routine stop. This wasn't about laws or regulations or anything they understood. They were caught in something far deeper, a web of suspicion, anger, and distrust, and there was no telling how this would end. As they moved closer to the car, the officer in charge looked over his shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll learn how things really work soon enough." And in that moment, they realized the frightening truth. They had already been judged. The advisors walked slowly, their steps measured as they followed the officers toward the squad car. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. The world around them seemed to blur, the flashing lights and the harsh voices growing distant, almost surreal. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew they were no longer in control. The officer who had first stopped them walked ahead, his back straight and rigid. The other officers flanked them, keeping a watchful eye on every move the advisors made. As they neared the squad car, the advisors exchanged a quick glance. Neither of them said a word, but both could feel the same unease settling in their chests. The feeling of being watched, judged, and manipulated weighed heavily on them. The officer in charge stopped in front of the car, his voice suddenly sharp. "Get in the car," he ordered. The advisor who had been driving hesitated for a moment. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. It was a simple question, but it felt loaded with fear. They had no idea what was coming next. "You'll find out soon enough," the officer replied, not even glancing back at them as he opened the door to the squad car. There was no compassion in his voice, no sign of empathy. It was as if they were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard, and the officer was simply moving them to the next square. Reluctantly, the advisors climbed into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut behind them with a resounding thud. They sat in silence, their hands resting on their laps, their minds racing. Every possible scenario played out in their heads. Was this an arrest? Were they going to be charged with something they hadn't done? Or was this just an act of intimidation? The car's engine roared to life and they were off. The advisors could feel the motion of the vehicle, but it didn't make them feel any less trapped. They looked out the windows, watching the city pass by, but nothing felt familiar. They were no longer part of the world they knew. The streets, the buildings, the people, all of it seemed distant, foreign, as if they had crossed into another reality entirely. The officer who had been speaking to them earlier sat in the front, his eyes fixed on the road. Every once in a while, he glanced in the rearview mirror, his gaze locking with theirs for a brief moment before looking away. It was unsettling, as if he was measuring them, studying their every move. The advisors didn't know how to react. They had no idea what to expect from this officer or what his intentions were. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the car as it navigated the streets. The advisors could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They weren't just being questioned anymore. They were being held, confined, and they had no idea what would happen next. The fear that had started as a faint sense of unease was now a full-blown knot in their stomachs. After what felt like an eternity, the squad car turned down a narrow alleyway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The advisor who had been sitting in the back tried to sit up straighter, his eyes scanning the area. The car stopped at a small, nondescript building, its lights dim and flickering. The officers in the front exchanged a few quiet words before the officer in charge turned to look at them. "Out," he said simply. The advisors didn't hesitate this time. They climbed out of the car, their feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. The cool air hit their faces, but it didn't do anything to calm their nerves. They were far from the safety of the White House, far from the world they knew. Now they were standing in a place that felt alien, a place where they had no power, no protection, and no idea what was going to happen. They were ushered into the building, which smelled faintly of stale air and old paper. It was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the walls. The advisors followed the officers down a narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway, the officer in charge stopped in front of a door, knocking sharply before entering without waiting for a response. Inside the room was a small table, a few chairs, and a file cabinet tucked in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of old paperwork and dust. The room felt sterile, impersonal, a far cry from the important meetings the advisors had attended earlier that day. They were no longer in the world of power and influence. This room was a prison and they were the prisoners. "Sit down," the officer ordered, gesturing to the chairs. The advisors didn't argue. They took their seats, their minds racing as they tried to make sense of what was happening. The officer who had been in charge of their stop remained standing, his arms crossed as he stared at them. "You're not in control here," he said, his voice cold. "I don't care who you work for. You're here because I say you are." The words stung more than they expected. The advisors had spent their careers making decisions, shaping policy, and dealing with the highest levels of government. Now, they were nothing more than prisoners, at the mercy of an officer who seemed to relish the power he held over them. The room was silent for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. The advisors exchanged a glance, but neither of them knew what to say. They were caught in a trap they didn't understand, their futures uncertain. The officer seemed to sense their unease, and his lips curled into a smirk. "You think this is just about you?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "No, this is bigger than you. This is about sending a message. You work for the people who think they can change everything without understanding the consequences. You think you can just walk in and fix the world, but you don't see the people like me. The people who are stuck in the system. You think you're above it all, but you're not. You're just a cog in the machine, just like everyone else." The advisor in the front seat tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. The officer had turned their world upside down in a matter of hours. They were no longer the powerful advisors they had been just a day ago. They were just people at the mercy of a system they didn't understand. "Your time will come," the officer continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "But for now, you're here. And you'll learn what it means to be powerless." The words hung in the air, a dark prophecy. The advisors could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them. The room seemed to close in around them, and for the first time, they truly felt what it was like to be trapped. They were no longer part of the world they had once known. They had crossed into a new reality, one where they had no control, no influence, and no idea how to escape. The night had grown colder, and the streets were eerily quiet. Inside the official car, the White House advisors felt a tension that had been building since the moment the police car had stopped them. They had shown their identification, explained their purpose, and tried to remain calm. But the officers outside seemed uninterested in facts or authority. Their eyes held suspicion, their voices sharp and cold. Each passing second felt heavier than the last. The advisors exchanged nervous glances, silently pleading with each other to stay calm. At first, it seemed like a routine stop, just a small inconvenience. But soon, it became clear that this was not ordinary. The officers' questions were repetitive and unreasonable, as though they wanted a mistake, any small excuse to justify their suspicion. The advisors answered politely, choosing their words carefully. One advisor, a woman with a calm, commanding presence, spoke in a steady voice. "We are on official duty. Here are our credentials. Please check them if you need to." The officers did not seem to listen. One tapped impatiently on the hood of the car, while another leaned closer to the window, squinting at the advisors' faces. Their tone carried something heavier than authority. It was mistrust, something personal, something unfair. The advisors tried to reason. They mentioned their mission, the time-sensitive nature of their journey, and even offered to show additional documentation. But nothing mattered. The officers' focus was not on the truth. Minutes passed like hours. The advisors felt trapped, as though the world outside had vanished, leaving only the tension-filled circle of flashing lights and watchful eyes. Inside the car, hearts raced, hands gripped the seats, and breaths came faster. Every movement outside seemed amplified, every word from the officers sharper. The advisors realized that calm words alone might not be enough. Fear was rising, not just for themselves, but for the integrity of their mission and the safety of the people who depended on them. One of the advisors, the youngest of the group, tried to lighten the tension with a small smile, hoping to connect on a human level. "We're all just people tonight," he said gently, hoping the officers would recognize reason over bias. But the officers seemed unmoved, their expressions unreadable, almost like they were waiting for a reason to escalate. The advisors felt a chilling realization. They were dealing not with law, but with prejudice and pride disguised as authority. Inside the car, whispers and quiet discussions took place. Each advisor tried to anticipate the next move, considering every possibility. Should they step out? Should they wait? Could they ask for a supervisor? Every option seemed fraught with uncertainty. Outside, the officers shifted position, their presence growing more imposing. The advisors' nerves were taut. Each small noise, the rustle of a uniform, the flash of a flashlight, the distant hum of a passing car, made their hearts leap. Then, without a clear reason, the officers demanded that the advisors step out of the car. The advisors hesitated, explaining that they were in official duty and that exiting might compromise their safety. The officers' insistence grew louder, more commanding. Fear began to mix with frustration. The advisors were trained to handle tense situations, but they had never faced something like this: the misuse of authority with no concern for fairness or reason. The youngest advisor's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle. The woman beside him took a deep breath, placing her hand over his, grounding him. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We do what we can. Don't let fear make the decisions for us." Her words were a fragile shield against the storm of uncertainty outside. Step by step, they followed the instructions, trying to maintain dignity and composure. Once outside, the advisors were surrounded by a heightened tension. The night air felt heavier, colder. Every gesture was watched, every word weighed. The advisors attempted again to explain their mission, their purpose, and their credentials. But the officers' suspicion seemed relentless. They questioned, circled, and observed in a way that was exhausting, both physically and mentally. The advisors realized that this was not a normal encounter. It had become a test of patience, endurance, and character, where every action was scrutinized under an unfair lens. The advisors tried to think clearly. They knew that any misstep could worsen the situation, yet they also knew they could not remain passive forever. They communicated quietly among themselves, planning carefully. They repeated facts calmly, showed documents, and maintained steady eye contact, hoping that clarity and honesty could pierce the stubborn fog of prejudice. Each word, each gesture was measured, deliberate, and full of intent. Time passed slowly, almost unbearably. The advisors' initial fear had turned into a tense determination. They realized they could not control the officers' attitudes, but they could control their own reactions. They focused on small victories. One officer finally glanced at the credentials, another seemed to hesitate before speaking. These were tiny cracks in the wall of hostility, small signs of reason trying to break through. Yet despite their efforts, the atmosphere remained tense, almost electric. The advisors felt an invisible line between authority and abuse, a line they could neither cross nor ignore. They understood that sometimes, courage was not about confrontation, but about enduring the moment with clarity, strength, and humanity. The advisors continued to speak respectfully, appealing to fairness, appealing to logic, appealing to the shared responsibility of the law. In the midst of this, one advisor recalled the lives affected by their mission, the people waiting for guidance, the decisions that would impact the nation. This thought strengthened them, reminded them that their duty was larger than the fear surrounding them. They drew on that resolve, showing calm determination in their posture, steadiness in their words, and confidence in their explanations. The officers, however, seemed caught between suspicion and recognition. They paused occasionally, glanced at the documents, looked at the advisors, then back at each other. The advisors noticed the slightest signs of hesitation. Every moment was critical, every gesture mattered. They understood that the path to safety and resolution required patience, composure, and careful observation. Though no immediate physical danger occurred, the advisors felt the emotional weight of the encounter. Fear, frustration, and a sense of injustice pressed down on them. Yet in the tension, a profound clarity emerged. The advisors realized that sometimes the hardest battles were not won with force, but with endurance, intelligence, and the unwavering commitment to truth. As the encounter drew on, the advisors hoped that reason would prevail, that fairness would emerge, and that this night could end without irreversible consequences. They continued to follow protocol, remain respectful, and maintain dignity in the face of unreasonable scrutiny. Their focus shifted from fear to presence, each moment observed carefully, each word spoken intentionally, each action measured against the invisible weight of justice. The night stretched endlessly, but the advisors' resolve never wavered. They had survived fear, confronted bias, and acted with integrity under immense pressure. Though the encounter was a tragic reminder of injustice, it was also a testament to human strength, professionalism, and courage in the face of uncertainty. And while the story's ending would bring sorrow and reflection, Part 5 captured the tension, the escalation, and the weight of being trapped in a situation where reason alone was not enough to ensure safety. The night had finally ended, but the weight of what had happened lingered heavily in the minds of everyone involved. The city streets were quieter now, the flashing lights gone, and the hum of distant traffic returning. Yet inside the hearts of the advisors, a storm still raged. The moments they had endured earlier replayed in their minds. The tense stares, the unreasonable demands, the feeling of being trapped under unfair scrutiny. Each detail seemed sharper in memory, like shadows etched into the night. As they drove away from the scene, the advisors remained silent for a long time. No one knew what to say, and words felt inadequate. The tension that had built during the encounter had transformed into a quiet, heavy sorrow. Each advisor thought about the fragility of trust, the thin line between protection and prejudice, and how easily authority could be misused. The experience had changed them, leaving an impression they knew would last a lifetime. By the time they returned to their office, the advisors were exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Their minds replayed every detail of the encounter, trying to understand what had happened, why it had happened, and what could have been done differently. They knew there would be questions from supervisors, from colleagues, from the public, but they also understood that some truths were not easy to explain. Some feelings could not be captured in words or reports. In the days that followed, the incident became the center of attention within their circle of work. Official statements were prepared, meetings were held, and the advisors were called to recount the event repeatedly. Each retelling felt like peeling back a layer of the night they had endured, exposing emotions that were still raw. The advisors noticed a mix of reactions: concern, disbelief, and support, but also a subtle discomfort among those who preferred not to dwell on such uncomfortable realities. Despite the professionalism expected of them, the advisors could not ignore the emotional impact. They had faced fear, injustice, and helplessness in a situation where their official roles and authority offered little protection. The memory of the officer's suspicion, the moments of tension, and the slow passage of time during the encounter remained vivid. Each advisor processed the experience differently. Some wrote detailed personal reflections, others confided in trusted colleagues, and some chose quiet contemplation, letting the memory settle like a stone in their hearts. The families of the advisors also felt the weight of what had happened. The incident had reminded them of the dangers their loved ones faced, not in distant lands or extreme situations, but close to home, in the very streets they walked every day. Conversations at home became more cautious, with questions about safety, trust, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The advisors themselves reflected on how life could change in an instant, how circumstances beyond their control could turn even a routine task into an ordeal. News of the incident began to spread beyond their immediate circle. Rumors and reports painted fragments of the story, sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted. The advisors realized that perception could be as influential as reality, and that the narrative others held about them could differ drastically from what they had truly experienced. They grappled with the tension between private truth and public perception, understanding that the world would not always recognize their courage or fairness, only the circumstances it witnessed. Public response was mixed. Some praised the advisors for their composure and patience, recognizing the restraint and intelligence required to navigate such a tense situation. Others questioned how such an encounter could have occurred in the first place, reflecting broader concerns about fairness, trust, and the responsibility of those in positions of authority. The incident became more than a personal experience. It became a lens through which society examined the delicate balance between power and justice. The advisors also had to process the personal lessons learned. They realized the importance of preparation, vigilance, and emotional intelligence in handling unpredictable encounters. They reflected on their own biases, assumptions, and expectations, considering how these shaped their reactions during the event. They came to understand that courage was not only about standing firm, but also about listening, observing, and maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. As investigations continued, the advisors were called to provide testimony and share their experience in detail. They spoke calmly, factually, and without anger, yet each word carried the weight of the night they had endured. Their recollections highlighted not only the specific events, but also the broader implications of authority, prejudice, and human behavior. Their voices, steady and deliberate, became a testament to the challenges faced when fairness and justice meet resistance. In quiet moments, away from the scrutiny of work and public attention, the advisors reflected deeply on the fragility of life and the unpredictability of human interactions. They realized that every person carries fears, assumptions, and limitations, and that sometimes these elements intersect in ways that can lead to hardship, misunderstanding, or loss. They felt gratitude for having survived the night, even as they mourned the emotional toll it had taken. The advisors also thought about responsibility, the responsibility of those in authority to act with fairness, of citizens to advocate for justice, and of individuals to uphold truth in difficult circumstances. The incident became a mirror, reflecting both the strengths and weaknesses of the society they served. It revealed the human capacity for error, bias, and prejudice, as well as the power of patience, clarity, and moral courage. Slowly, life began to resume a sense of normalcy, though the advisors knew things would never be the same. Every trip outside, every interaction with authority carried a subtle shadow of that night. Yet they also carried the lessons learned, the importance of careful communication, the value of composure under pressure, and the enduring strength found in solidarity. Each advisor found small ways to honor the experience through reflection, mentorship, and commitment to fairness in their work. The city, too, felt the ripple of the incident. Conversations about authority, trust, and fairness became more frequent in workplaces, homes, and public forums. People discussed the importance of empathy, patience, and accountability. The advisors, though no longer in the immediate glare of scrutiny, realized that their experience had sparked reflection in others, a recognition that fairness and justice require vigilance, awareness, and courage. In the end, the advisors understood that life often presents challenges that cannot be fully controlled. Encounters with injustice, fear, or misunderstanding are inevitable, but the choices one makes in those moments define character. By maintaining composure, adhering to truth, and treating others with respect, even when fairness is denied, one can navigate the most difficult circumstances with integrity. As months passed, the advisors continued their work, but the memory of that night remained vivid. They carried it not as a burden, but as a reminder of the delicate balance between courage and caution, authority and empathy, fear and composure. They remembered the lessons learned, the fragility of trust, the importance of preparation, and the enduring strength found in patience and dignity. The story of that night became part of their personal and professional narrative, a chapter of growth, reflection, and resilience. They shared their experience quietly with trusted colleagues, mentors, and friends, knowing that the lessons were valuable for anyone navigating the unpredictable world of authority, power, and human behavior. It was a story not just of fear and tension, but of perseverance, moral courage, and the capacity to endure when circumstances seem unfair or overwhelming. Though the night had been tragic and challenging, the advisors emerged wiser, more aware, and more committed to their mission. They understood that change begins not only in policies and institutions, but also in the choices individuals make every day. The choice to act with fairness, to recognize bias, and to maintain humanity even in the most difficult encounters. The incident remained a silent teacher, a reminder that the world is complex, that injustice can appear even in familiar places, and that courage often means facing the unexpected with dignity. The advisors moved forward carrying both the pain and the wisdom of that night, ready to continue their work, strengthened by experience and guided by the lessons learned. In that way, the tragedy became not just an ending, but a beginning, an enduring call to fairness, reflection, and integrity in the face of adversity.